We're going to turn the dial on now to look at, we've talked a bit about affordability, and we're going to specifically hone in on affordable housing schemes. Shared ownership will be a major feature of this session, I'm sure. So we've got Peter Williams, who's next up from the University of Cambridge, to talk us through a bit about affordable housing schemes, private government, and everything else in between. So Peter, over to you.
I thought I'd put on a tie today just to remind you of the world that we used to live in. And also it's been hanging in the cupboard and you kind of think, isn't it time you use some of these things? I'm glad to see there are a few others in the room. This is in many ways a niche area, but it's actually not a niche area any longer, given the description and trends in home ownership that we've been reflecting on earlier. So I want to reflect on that and just build a picture and then talk about the launch of the Shared Ownership Council, which is emerging as we speak. We've said a few things already about home ownership. Clearly, the total has been contracting. And of course, within specific groups, it's actually really quite desperately contracting. Single people would be a good example of where home ownership is increasingly difficult and problematic. And it's also changing that balance between mortgaged home ownership and outright home ownership. It's inevitable it would change. You've got to think about it. People have a run of years in a mortgage, and then ultimately they stop paying that and they become outright. That growth path was inevitably going to mean that the balance between outright and mortgage would change, and it really has now. And so increasingly, home ownership is also dominated by the older age groups, people like me. And it's partly, as has been touched on already, partly affordability. It's partly about the current rates, but it is also about the changing job market, which is more problematic for lenders, not least in terms of self-cert and people setting up their own businesses, etc. And of course, the key role that the bank of mum and dad play in access to home ownership, that can reach anywhere between 30 and 50%. The bank of mum and dad is now under strain. Obviously, the bank of mum and dad is selective anyway. Not everybody has a mum and dad with a home-owned property, clearly. And so that's selective. But of course, the bank of mum and dad is also under strain, and therefore the supply of cash from the bank of mum and dad is going down. So all of those things put together actually means the pressure on mainstream mortgage market, mainstream home ownership market, is really quite intense, which of course then leads to more activity at the margins of home ownership, whether it be in terms of products or schemes. And that's where obviously the affordable housing schemes becoming significant and important. And of course, we have that balancing effect of the private rented sector, the growth of the private rented sector, many people in that sector now who are would-be homeowners, but of course trapped into a sector where ever higher rents are putting pressure on their capacity to save and build the deposit necessary. You can see here just the trends in tenure between outright, the green line, and mortgaged, how they've risen and dipped and changed over time. But that's a fundamental shift, which will just continue for a sustained period as we go forward. And obviously, the lower the rate of entry through mortgaged home ownership, that means that will magnify. And so I want to touch really on this then, the case for more affordable homes. If we want to, I mean, it's a question mark, do we want to get back to the sort of EU average of 70% home ownership? Britain is now in the low rungs of the league table of home ownership. It was always in the low rungs because of Eastern European mass sales of public housing into the home ownership sector. Mrs. Thatcher was always very angry about the fact that home ownership levels were higher in Hungary and elsewhere than they were in Britain. Somehow that was seen as a very bad thing. If we want to get back to 70%, there's a lot of merit in that, then we have to think about the provision at the margins. And the gap, I think, between the mainstream mortgage market and private renting has grown. And it's hard to put the numbers on this, but it has grown. And it's therefore hard to say precisely how much it's grown. But the government has been the primary mechanism of the bridging between those two sectors, albeit that obviously we've had 95%, 100% mortgages, which are very significant in terms of policing that margin and increasing access. But I'm focusing obviously on the affordable housing schemes. So what are those schemes? Well, they vary and change with almost as speedily as the ministers change. I think the figure is we've had 7 housing ministers since the start of 2022. Which gives you some idea of the kind of rapid turnover. But of course, that is at a minister level rather than the Secretary of State level. And actually, if you look at all departments, they've all had huge changes. Help to Buy has been much trailed here. Wales has, as always, been a highly significant innovator in thinking to change Help to Buy to Help to Stay, which is it's continued its Help to Buy scheme. It's not closed in the same way the England scheme has. And they're now reverting it into a Help to Stay scheme, which is helping existing owners remain in their properties. Hard to know how that's going to work out. It's a very small scheme at the moment. Shared ownership has been touched upon, and it's got many variants, shared ownership, people with learning disabilities, older person shared ownership. There are a number of varieties the government's rolled out over the years, as well as changing the title constantly. First homes, it's interesting, all the presentations we've had so far, not a word has been mentioned about first homes, which supposedly is the market discount scheme, which the house builders are going to run out. It's only in its pilot phase. It's only done 1,300 units. And that's with grant. So the rollout into a full market scheme outside of the grant regime, we await to see again whether it becomes policy and whether then it gathers any momentum. You don't sense it. Rent to Buy, which is obviously relevant to some of the things we've been touching on, I'll come back to, but the government doesn't even publish data on that. And then there are obviously other private schemes, private rent to buy schemes, etc. And of course, we've got mortgage guarantee scheme, which is significant, about 24,000 people annually using that. And then we've got a variety of lender products. Data on those is always very mysterious about whether they're teaser products designed to get people to go onto the lender websites rather than full stream products that they're really putting their shoulder behind. It would be lovely to know what numbers really come through some of those schemes. Just on shared ownership, that's the kind of picture of the dominance of shared ownership. This is not including Help to Buy, and of course you can see the dramatic impact that First Homes had. It's clearly very significant, so put your shoulders to the wheels, team, and we'll see where that goes. And Rent to Buy, I mean, Stuart mentioned all the gabbling that goes on in Whitehall. There was a huge amount of activity around Rent to Buy as the new runner. I mean, all of us can think of ways you might try and bridge this huge population of would-be buyers sitting in the PRS into the home ownership market. They're all good payers of rent. There's obviously the recognition in credit and good performance in their credit reference has never really been fully taken account of, it seems to me. But how can you transition decent rent payers into decent home mortgage buyers? They did this scheme. They funded Homes and Community Agency, as it was at the time, funded about 6,000 in 2008 to 11. And then we've got further scheme funded through the GLA. But the numbers are relatively small. And indeed, neither of those bodies actually collect data on it. The government seems to want to progress that. It's an obvious thing when you're kind of dreaming up how do you promote home ownership. It's the obvious one to go. But it almost seems at times too difficult. And the only little bit of data I could find on this, for what it's worth, was an Inside Housing survey done in 2019, just looking at the column over there where the rent-to-buy homes completed. You can see it comes at about 1,500, 1,600. But actually the number actually progressing into rent-to-buy was only 180. In other words, what people have found in practice is that with rents escalating, people's capacity to then to make the jump into buying the home that they're renting actually prove very problematic. And you can understand that when you think about it. Also, of course, you've got to ask yourself the question, do I want to rent the home so I want to buy the home that I rent? I mean, actually, I think a lot of people say they don't. They want to live somewhere else. So it kind of is it's an idea that sounds great. It's a bit like adjustable shelves, you know. You've got the theory of adjusting them, but you never do. And it's the theory of rent to buy is sort of a bit, well, it makes sense to do that, but actually when you get down to the practicalities of it, it's actually quite difficult to transition into a reality. So it's been a sort of problematic scheme where I begin to ask myself the question, if the government really is saying to itself, rent to buy is the way forward, the evidence doesn't really support it terribly. So somebody in this room needs to come up with a whizzy, better way of doing it in a way that I and many others have yet to achieve. Then we had, interesting, this is Homes England. So in other words, the issue here is that you've got to remember that this is Homes England, which covers England minus London. So all these numbers, I mean, this is the weird world of government statistics and all the rest. This data relates to everywhere other than London, where many of these schemes are quite important. However, I mean, the interesting thing on Help to Buy, when they kicked it off, they expected to do 78,000. They then got a firm objective of 297. They've delivered 388. So it's been hugely significant, hugely significant. First Homes had a 1,500 objective, and they think, this is Homes England, from their annual report is worth looking at if you want to dig into some of these weird data. They think their best estimate will do 1.3. Shared ownership, bizarrely, they don't actually mention what their expectations are, but they've delivered 27,000 odd into home ownership in 22-23. And what the figure that I thought was interesting there is they also make the statement they've assisted into home ownership over that 5-year period about 250,000, so about 50,000 a year. Now, these aren't insignificant numbers. I mean, it's interesting, Stuart focused very much on Help to Buy, but actually some of these other schemes, many of it is Section 106, where it's a subvention against the builder who gives over land or money or both to help build affordable housing. So it's a significant programme of activity, and this is, again, England minus London. Clearly, Help to Buy was very significant, but it is worth remembering of that 388, only about 20% were people who couldn't have bought anyway. So in other words, I always call Help to Buy bigger, better, sooner. In other words, what it did for many people is they were able to buy a bigger home in a better location rather faster than they would have done. But they could have bought anyway. That's the point. And so that was a significant change. But 20% is not insignificant nonetheless. It's still, you know, good numbers, and these numbers matter at this margin. Trying to estimate the number of people who want to be in home ownership, who aren't in home ownership, is highly problematic, as you can imagine. Many people, the annual UK Finance kind of surveys reporting on people's tenure preferences always say tenure preference is about 80% of people want to be homeowners. Here we are at 64 and going down. It's a very wide estimate, isn't it? 1 to 2 million. There's lots of market growth there. Now, again, crude estimates, the demand for shared ownership, how do you measure it? Not easy, because it's a rationed good. It's provided dominantly through housing associations, and that relies in part on grant funding. So in other words, you don't get a picture of real demand, you just get a picture of the flow through their grant-funded program. Estimate would be it's about 3 times the demand of what is supplied. And Glenn Bramley, an academic from Heriot-Watt who does periodic estimates of housing need and demand, he would highlight for the bottom 40% of the population, there's a demand for somewhere between 25 and 30,000. Well, given we're building perhaps 17, 18, there's quite a gap even there. Obviously, there's a growing list of providers on the private side. There are lots of issues about the numbers that might be generated. Obviously, the desire is there to grow this market, not least because it's backed by private investment as opposed to public investment, and that's a key breakthrough point given the squeeze on public finances. So that's really, really significant. But obviously, one of the issues there is that it's still surprisingly difficult to get traction, as some in the room would know. And I think some of these providers are now getting bigger just by buying books of shared ownership from existing housing providers who are keen to cash in on their shared ownership because they need money to upgrade the quality of their properties. So there's a kind of problem at the moment in terms of what we count and how we count it. So just sort of driving forward towards a close. I mean, this is, a focus here on the intermediate market, somewhere between private renting and somewhere between mainstream home ownership. Probably, the million plus that are in there. There is without doubt, a growing appetite to invest in that. People recognise that is a stable and viable market, albeit one in which the data is absolutely dreadful. And all of us in the room who are interested in data need to put our shoulders to the wheel on that one. Grant funding is declining. So in fact, the affordable housing provision that's been coming through on shared ownership is not giving the momentum, and it won't be increased. And as I said earlier, some of the not-for-profit providers are cutting back. And then there's real tensions, of course, that about half shared ownership output is done through what's called Section 106. And the priority if and when the government launches First Homes into the scheme is that First Homes gets first dibs in the Section 106 allocation. So that will squeeze shared ownership. So if these numbers are bad, they're going to get worse unless something is done to lift it. And of course, there are some real tensions around the performance of some of the shared ownership providers that exist out there. The Housing Ombudsman wrote a very critical report. I know nobody wants to hear criticism, but it does highlight that one of the problems with shared ownership has been a focus on getting people into it, but not on the journey into full ownership. It's the management through the process where all of us are guilty, whether as lenders, providers, brokers and others, of having a bit of that territory, but not really having it all together in a coordinated way. So I think there's a growing view that we need both a better and a bigger shared ownership market. And that leads into sort of what I will sort of close upon. Over the last 12 months or more, Lloyds Banking Group has been sponsoring a task group looking at shared ownership in relation to scale and performance. The view is that much more could be done to improve the customer experience and not least the journey to full ownership, as I've mentioned. And what's been the outcome of that is to create a cross-industry, so not just providers, but lenders, brokers, lawyers and others, which brings together all of those parties to build a better and a bigger shared ownership sector, with ultimately backed by, this is all the voluntary, a voluntary approach. Doesn't have government backing at this stage, to create a code of compliance regime which can improve the customer experience and therefore build better data and therefore build the stronger case, if you like, for more investment, private or public. And that's being incubated through something you'd be familiar with them, the Home Buying and Selling Group. And there's a shared ownership group now formed into that. And this new body will open for membership. It will be a membership-driven thing. It's got startup funding through a variety of funders and others, some of whom are represented in this room, and for which we are very grateful. And then it will open to be funded by membership in 2024. So I think my assumption is Help to Buy will end. I mean, there is anger in government about profits taken by the house building industry, and it was the government's own failure, in my mind, that they set up the scheme without properly establishing what the criteria might be and setting some parameters about what could be expected through it. But that's the nature of these schemes. They're started for a political reason. It's only later do you live to regret what you didn't do. And I think in that sense, if First Homes hardly does anything, nobody suggested a great deal, Rent to Buy, I think I'm arguing, probably can't do anything as it's currently conceived. Shared ownership becomes very, very significant in the scheme of things. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think more constructively around that and the ways we might do things with that. And I think the Shared Ownership Council potentially can drive improvements in that and growth and bring a real focus to bear on that in a way that it's been very disparate till now. So that's it. The aim of it is very much to work with the grain. There are lots of initiatives going on around shared ownership, whether it's be providers, government, lenders. I mean, the Newbury Building Society is doing a nice new programme of work around staircasing and helping smooth out the staircasing process, which is far too problematic and complicated than it needs to be. So working with the existing initiatives, but also working with government to, and the agencies obviously like the regulator and Homes England, to bring all those different strands together to create a really vibrant sense of what can be done with a tenure which has its strengths, has its weaknesses, but has been long running. It's been around since 1980. Some of you might not even have been born when it started. And the reason why there was a repairing obligation given to the home buyers was John Stanley, who was the minister at the time, wanted there to be a real incentive that people migrated to full ownership. And so that's why the repairing obligation was put in place. But it is a problematic repairing obligation, as many people have discovered. So on that note, I shall stop. Thank you.